I have been waiting for this sermon for a number of years. I've been waiting for this sermon to say, we're going to focus on theology and spiritual concepts and what happens when we die and our UU principles. I've been saying for years that I really am not interested in politics, and yet time and again over the past few years, I've had to throw out what I was going to talk about on a moment's notice to address the inherent dignity violations happening in the United States. I've been looking forward to this day, and I named my sermon, Isn't It Ironic? Because when that day finally came, instead of getting to bask in the sermon writing bliss of deep theological thought, I ended up in bed with COVID all week. And so my first post-Trump sermon is from home with a fever. And yet, isn't that just fitting? Because we may have a new direction in our country. We may feel that for the first time in 4 years, we have somebody who cares about us and all of our neighbors. And there is a lot of work to do. We still have a pandemic. We still live in a point in history when there is this virus that plays Russian roulette with us. I'm going to be okay. I have made it through this virus with 6 days of fever. But not everybody else who gets this virus has been or will be. And that is also our reality right now. So it's not all puppies and roses. And at the same time, I really believe that we have turned a corner. I do feel like a number of us are able to exhale for the first time in a long time. And the picture, there's this beautiful picture of so many beautiful women from the inauguration, so dignified and classy and elegant. This image of beautiful, graceful women showing up in their own power on Wednesday. And this is our future. And this dignity and elegance has nothing to do with politics. And it has everything to do with where we are going as humanity. So yes, there is work to be done because there is always work to be done, because everything doesn't just become perfect overnight. But it's also okay to take some time to sit in the joy of something new being birthed. I kind of thought of the inauguration on Wednesday like the image I had was of this airplane that has been flying at one altitude, and then it starts to rise and it hits some turbulence and bounces a little bit, and then it just goes straight up. And I kind of feel like from a frequency level, that is what happened on Wednesday. We had been at this lower elevation, bumping around, and then we started rising when Amanda Gorman shared her poem. And that plane simply lifted and took off. And it's not about looking back or disliking the lower elevation. It's just a completely different elevation with the lower one left behind. And now people can stay there if they want to, or they can rise up and join in the elevation, the ascension. So this is why I feel good today, because I get to shift my focus back to theology. What is it that we believe? And what role does that belief system play in our lives? To me, theology is nothing more or less than the attempt to make meaning out of our day-to-day existence. If we begin to do this on a conscious level, we may be surprised at how our theology is impacting our day-to-day lives, either in positive ways or in detrimental ways. Because what we believe does matter. A few years ago, I titled a sermon called Eschatology, Epistemology, and Soteriology. And it's not that I love these three big words, but it is what they mean and what they represent. Eschatology is the study of final events, of death. We all die. And what I find fascinating is that what we believe about how or what happens when we die is going to impact how we live and the decisions that we're making right now while we're alive. Soteriology is the study of salvation, or in other words, where in our lives do we find hope? How do we set our souls free? What does it mean to experience true forgiveness or offer forgiveness? And epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we make sense of the world around us? How do we know what we know? And what is consciousness? So this is theological language, but it's not relegated to some academic exercise. It is how we live our day-to-day lives. So the fact of the matter is, whether we decide to engage or disengage with religious or theological language, we as human beings are going to be faced with these questions of ultimate meaning. And in the past year alone, these three words have played out time and again in each of our lives as we make small decisions about whether to go to the grocery store. Do we stay in isolation from other people until there is a vaccine? When do we take our chances and venture out into the world again in a cautious way, knowing that we might risk contracting a virus that might kill us, or might simply waylay us for a few weeks, or might not impact us at all? And we look around and we say, will I be active and create a mutual aid network to feed the people around me in these uncertain times? Or do I stock up my own supplies for my own family for a rainy day? Do I go out into the world or do I withdraw from it? These are all theological questions. In essence, these questions become a lived theology. And so I want us to take just a minute to think about something now. If you look at how you have lived your life in the past year, or in the past 4 years, or even in the past decade, can you, if you really looked at it, would you be able to glean what your theology of life is? It's something to think about. Would it be an optimistic view of humanity and our human potential? What is the underlying paradigm of ultimate reality as you understand it? Are we being guided, or are we completely on our own? And how does what we believe about that one question impact what we're doing in our day-to-day lives right now? Is the universe ultimately one of compassion or one of indifference? And how is that underlying belief system being played out in your life? These are all theological questions. Eschatology, soteriology, epistemology. Large theological words, and yet they transcend the human experience. Regardless of our belief system or world paradigm, as human beings, we ask these questions. What is the ultimate meaning in life? Where is the hope? What happens when we die? As Unitarian Universalists, we've been very good at looking at these concepts through an intellectual lens and studying them through the various perspectives of different religious traditions and paradigms. But sometimes, and I think we're getting better at it, sometimes we're not so good at doing the interpersonal work and looking at these concepts in our own day-to-day lives. There is a joke that says, if a UU is taking a path and there is a fork in the road, and one sign points to the left saying, this way to experience God, and another sign is pointing to the right that says, discussion about God, most Unitarian Universalists will take the path to the right to join the discussion, because it's easier to think about some of these concepts as a safe intellectual exercise than it is to actually begin to live into the concepts and implement them in our lives. And yet, even as I tell this joke that I'm sure some of you have heard before, I think that that paradigm is changing. And I think we have all fundamentally been changed over the last 4 years, and especially over the past 12 months. I don't think there are very many human beings who have not done a little bit of inner soul work this year. Even people who are not the least bit spiritual have to do some deep inner work when their livelihood is stripped away literally overnight. When somebody you love gets a fever on Monday and is on a respirator by Friday. When you are just getting back to normal and you get a phone call that everything needs to stop and you need to quarantine for 14 days. This is a new normal for us, and it forces us to interrupt our patterns and do some deep inner reflection. And believe it or not, this exact process is what I call theology. My favorite definition of theology comes from Forrest Church, who defines religion as our human response to the dual reality of being alive and having to die. So simple and so true, and we make it complicated, but it's really not. By that definition, we are all theologians. We just didn't know it. Our human response to the dual reality of being alive and having to die. Christopher Hitchens says, religion is part of the human makeup. It is also part of our cultural and intellectual history. Religion was our first attempt at literature, our first attempt at cosmology, making sense of where we are in the universe, our first attempt at healthcare, believing in faith healing, our first attempt at theology. And so, as we enter into this new year, coming out of 2020 and entering into 2021, when hopefully we won't be pivoting on a dime to talk about our inherent worth and dignity principle of all human beings over and over again, I'm excited for us to be able to start reflecting again on what is theology? What is religion? What is spirituality? What does that have to offer us? What is a faith community? And how does that play out in our lived lives in this role, in this year of 2020. So I'm excited. I went to seminary because I love these kind of questions. And if you have joined the church or found us in the last 4 years, you may think, well, they talk a lot about politics. And over the last 4 years, we have talked a lot of politics, more than I've been comfortable with. But it has always been because of the underlying Unitarian Universalist principles of the interconnected web, of the inherent worth and dignity, of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and how that was living out in this world that we live in together. And I'm excited that now we get to expand that conversation with each other. We get to start asking these questions and living into our theology in a way that I'm hoping for the next few years can leave the politics behind. So I'm going to just go ahead and throw out that question to us to take a little bit of time to think about. Do you guys realize that you have been doing theology this year without knowing it? And how does that show up in your lives right now?